They say an alpha king fears nothing, that power makes you invincible, that when you rule an empire you control everything beneath your crown. But here's the truth they don't tell you. The most dangerous moment in any king's life isn't when he loses his kingdom. It's when he realizes he destroyed the only thing that ever made him human. This is the story of King Draven Morcant, the Lion of the North, who conquered nations but couldn't conquer his own cowardice, and the woman he threw away like trash, who came back carrying the one weapon that could bring him to his knees: his son. If you want to know how an empire almost burned because one man was too afraid to love, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know my tribe is here. The winter wind cut through Vareth's capital like a blade through silk, howling past marble towers that pierced the sky with arrogant grace. Inside the obsidian palace, King Draven Morcant stood at a window overlooking his empire, watching snow dust the rooftops of a city that trembled at his name. He should have felt triumphant. 3 months ago, his armies had crushed the rebellion in the eastern provinces. 2 weeks ago, he'd signed treaties that expanded Vareth's borders further than any king in 5 generations. Yesterday, his advisors had presented 12 marriage proposals from the most powerful noble houses in the realm. Instead, he felt hollow. The kind of emptiness that power can't fill because power created it in the first place. Draven turned from his window, his reflection ghosting across glass like an accusation. 32 years old. Battle-scarred. Alpha-born with dominance bred into his bones and violence trained into his hands. The Lion of the North, they called him. The unconquered, the Iron Crown. All of it true. None of it enough. He moved through the royal chambers with restless energy, past tapestries depicting his ancestors' victories and furniture worth more than most villages earned in a decade. The silence felt suffocating. It always did now, ever since he'd filled it with her absence. Celine. Her name tasted like broken glass in his mind. For 3 months she'd been his secret, his sanctuary, the one place his crown couldn't follow. She'd moved through these chambers like smoke, invisible to everyone but him. An Omega Palace attendant, nobody special, no bloodline worth mentioning. Just a girl who folded his ceremonial robes and poured his wine, and somehow made the weight of an empire feel bearable. He'd kissed her first in the Eastern Gallery, surrounded by statues of dead kings who'd probably never felt anything real in their entire lives. She'd tasted like forbidden fruit and dangerous choices, like everything he'd been taught to avoid. For 3 months, he'd been weak. For 3 months, he'd been happy. Then yesterday morning, he'd looked at her, sleeping in his bed, and felt terror grip his throat like an assassin's hand. What the hell was he doing? He was a king. She was a servant. Love didn't change bloodlines. Affection didn't alter station. If the court discovered he'd been bedding an Omega attendant, the scandal would crack his authority like rotten wood. Noble houses would smell weakness. Rivals would sharpen knives. Everything he'd built would teeter because he couldn't control his own damn heart. So he'd done what kings do when they're cornered by their own humanity. He'd amputated it. When she woke, he'd already dressed in full royal regalia, armor instead of skin, crown instead of trust. He'd met her confused smile with glacial eyes and words he'd practiced until they lost all warmth. This ends now. She'd stared at him like he'd struck her. Your Majesty? Don't, he'd said. Don't pretend you didn't know this was temporary. He'd watched her face crumble. Watched hope die in real time. It had taken everything in him not to reach for her, not to take it back, not to admit that he was terrified and stupid and making the worst mistake of his life. Instead, he'd pulled a purse of gold from his desk and set it on the table between them like she was a transaction he needed to close. For your discretion, he'd said, and your immediate departure from the palace. The sound she'd made, that small broken inhale, still echoed in his skull 3 months later. She'd left without another word. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself he'd done the right thing. He told himself a lot of lies that winter. Now Draven stood in his empty chambers, surrounded by wealth that meant nothing, and power that felt like poison, and wondered why victory tasted like ash. A knock interrupted his spiral. Come. His chief advisor, Lord Malus, entered with the cautious energy of a man approaching a caged wolf. 60 years old, clever as a viper. Loyal to the crown if not necessarily the king wearing it. Your Majesty, the council awaits your decision regarding the Rothmere proposal. Draven didn't turn from the window. The Rothmere daughter, 20 years old, pretty in that manufactured noble way, bloodline that traced back to the first kings, a political alliance that would stabilize the Western territories for a generation. Everything a king should want. I'll review it tomorrow. Malus cleared his throat. Sire, they've been waiting 3 weeks. If you continue to delay, they may interpret it as rejection. Then let them interpret it however they damn well please. The advisor's silence carried volumes of judgment. Draven could feel the unspoken accusation hanging between them. For months now, he'd been rejecting every marriage proposal, avoiding every noble gathering, ruling his kingdom with ruthless efficiency, while his personal life remained frozen in place. The court whispered about it. They always did. Some said he was waiting for a political advantage. Others claimed he was simply too busy consolidating power. A few suggested he preferred the company of soldiers to ladies, which Draven found grimly amusing given the truth. None of them knew about Selene. None of them could ever know. Is there anything else, Malus? The advisor hesitated. There is one matter, unrelated. A message arrived this morning from Hollowmere, a frontier settlement 3 days south, pine forests and mountain fog and people who didn't give a damn about royal politics. Draven had never been there, had no reason to care about it. And a birth registration, required by law for all settlements under crown jurisdiction. The mother listed no father. Draven's jaw tightened. I'm not interested in provincial bureaucracy. Of course, sire. Malus paused. The mother's name was listed as Selene Vale. The world stopped. Just for a second, just long enough for Draven's heart to forget how to beat. Selene. His Selene. No, not his. Not anymore. Not ever, really. The date of birth, Malus continued carefully, was approximately 8 months after she left palace service. Mathematics became violence. 3 months together. 3 months since he'd thrown her out. 8 months total. A child. His child. The realization hit like a warhammer to the chest. She'd been pregnant when he'd handed her that purse of gold and told her to disappear. Pregnant when he'd dismissed her like she meant nothing. Pregnant, alone. And he'd been too blind with fear to even consider the possibility. Draven turned slowly, and Malus took an involuntary step backward. The king's expression must have been terrifying because the advisor's hand twitched toward the door. You're certain? The timing aligned, sire, and the description matches the former attendant who served in the royal chambers during that period. Former attendant. As if she'd been furniture that got replaced. Leave me. Your Majesty, if this child is indeed... I said leave. Malus fled. Draven stood alone in the center of his magnificent prison, surrounded by gold and marble and the suffocating weight of his own choices. A son. He had a son. Somewhere in a frontier village, Selene was raising his child. Alone. Without his name, his protection, his resources. Everything a king should provide, she was managing without because he'd been too much of a coward to fight for her. The crown demands sacrifice. That's what he'd told himself when he'd sent her away. Kings can't afford weakness. Love is leverage. Attachment is vulnerability. All the brutal lessons his father had beaten into him during childhood, reinforced by every military campaign and political betrayal he'd survived. But standing there now, Draven understood a truth his father had never learned. Sometimes the things we sacrifice to keep power are the only things that make power worth having. He moved to his desk, pulled out parchment, started to write a summons, then stopped. What would he say? Come back so I can claim the child I pretended didn't exist? Return to the palace where I humiliated you so I can make it right with royal decree? No. If he wanted to fix this, if he wanted to earn the right to know his own son, he couldn't do it from a throne. He had to go to her, not as a king, as a man. 4 days later, Draven rode into Hollowmere disguised in common traveler's clothes, his distinctive features hidden beneath a hood. 2 guards accompanied him, dressed similarly, their weapons concealed. The settlement emerged from morning mist like something half-forgotten by civilization. Timber buildings, muddy roads. The kind of place where people came to escape their pasts, not decorate them. Perfect place for a woman who wanted to disappear. The market square bustled with frontier commerce, hunters selling pelts, farmers hawking root vegetables, Children chasing each other between stalls while their parents bartered over flour and nails. Simple, honest, 1,000 miles from palace intrigue. Draven felt like an alien. He asked careful questions, listened to gossip, learned that Celine worked at the Thorn's Rest Inn, that she kept to herself, that she had a son named Lucian who was clever and kind and had the most unusual silver eyes anyone had ever seen. Silver eyes. Alpha trait. His trait. Draven found the inn near the eastern edge of town, 2 stories, well-maintained, smoke curling from the chimney. Through the front window he could see the common room where travelers ate breakfast and locals gathered for warmth. And there, moving between tables with a tray balanced on her hip, was Celine. 4 years hadn't diminished her. If anything, motherhood had added steel to her grace. She moved with quiet efficiency, pouring coffee and collecting plates, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. No palace finery, no elaborate cosmetics, just a woman working hard and surviving harder. She looked beautiful. She looked strong. She looked like she'd built a life without him and didn't need him anywhere near it. Draven's courage faltered. What right did he have to walk back into her world? What possible excuse could justify the damage he'd done? Sorry seemed like an insult. I was wrong felt insufficient. I'm your king meant nothing here. He was about to retreat to reconsider this entire foolish journey when the inn door opened and a child ran outside. 4 years old, dark hair catching sunlight, silver eyes bright with innocent joy. Lucien, his son. The boy clutched a wooden horse, galloping it through imaginary adventures while making sound effects that echoed across the market square. He had Draven's jaw, Celine's smile, a perfect fusion that stole the breath from the king's lungs. Lucien! Celine's voice carried from the doorway. Not too far. Okay, Mama. Draven watched his son play, watched Celine watch their son, and felt something crack open inside his chest. All the justifications he'd built, all the political logic, all the careful reasoning about duty and sacrifice and what kings couldn't afford to feel, it all turned to dust. Because here was the truth, raw and undeniable. He'd thrown away his family to protect his crown, and his crown had never felt heavier. Celine turned to go back inside. Lucien chased his wooden horse toward a market stall, and Draven made a choice that would change 3 lives forever. He stepped forward. Celine, he said quietly. She froze mid-step. Her entire body went rigid like she'd been turned to stone. Slowly, so slowly it hurt to watch, she turned around. Their eyes met across 20 feet of dirt road and 4 years of silence. Her face went through a sequence of emotions too fast to track. Shock, disbelief, recognition. Then something harder, something that looked like rage wrapped in ice. You. The word carried enough venom to kill a lesser man. Draven opened his mouth, closed it. Every prepared speech vanished. What do you say to the woman whose life you destroyed? How do you begin to apologize for abandonment? He started. I heard about... Lucien chose that moment to crash into his mother's legs, laughing and waving his toy horse. Mama, look! He's jumping mountains! Celine's expression transformed instantly. All the hardness melted into warmth as she looked down at their son. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Very brave horse. The boy looked up at Draven with curious silver eyes. Who's that? Time stopped. Draven looked at Celine. Celine looked at Draven. The entire world balanced on the edge of what came next. Nobody, Celine said firmly. Nobody important. She scooped Lucien up, turned her back on the king, and walked into the inn without another word. Draven stood alone in the market square, dismissed more thoroughly than any battlefield defeat had ever managed. And he realized something crucial. This wasn't going to be like conquering a province or intimidating a rival lord. This was going to be war, the kind fought without swords, the kind he had no idea how to win. For 3 days, Draven haunted Hollowmere like a ghost. He took a room at another inn, watched Celine's routines, learned her schedule, saw how she moved through the settlement with quiet dignity, how people respected her, how she'd built a life from the wreckage he'd created. Lucien attended a small school run by a retired soldier. The boy was bright, popular with other children, quick to laugh and slow to anger. Everything a father should be proud of. everything Draven had missed. He also learned about Mara Thorne, the innkeeper who'd taken Celine in. 60 years old, tough as boot leather. Former battlefield medic who'd seen enough of the world to develop strong opinions about it. She watched Draven, watching Celine, and her expression suggested she knew exactly who he was and what he deserved. On the fourth day, Draven intercepted Celine on her way to the market. She saw him coming and her jaw set like granite. "Keep walking," she said without slowing. "We need to talk." We needed to talk 4 years ago. Now we need nothing. "I know about Lucien." That stopped her. She turned slowly, and the fury in her eyes could have melted steel. "You know nothing about Lucien. You know nothing about me. You know nothing except how to throw money at problems and pretend they disappear." "I was wrong." She laughed. Actually laughed. Cold and sharp and utterly without humor. "You were wrong. 4 years. 4 years of raising our son alone. 4 years of explaining to him why he doesn't have a father. 4 years of working myself raw to provide what you could have given with one word. And now you show up and say you were wrong? I want to make it right. There is no right. There's just you standing here thinking your regret means something, thinking showing up erases what you did." Draven felt anger spike in response, not at her, at himself, at the situation, at the truth she was throwing in his face. "He's my son," he said, and his voice carried the dangerous edge that made generals nervous. Celine stepped closer, fearless. "He's my son. Mine. I carried him. I birthed him. I fed him and clothed him and taught him how to be good in a world that taught me how to be disposable. You're just the man who threw us away." The words landed like physical blows. "I was protecting the kingdom. You were protecting yourself." Her voice dropped to something quieter and infinitely more cutting. "You were terrified, not of scandal, not of political consequences. You were terrified of needing someone, of being vulnerable, of discovering that all your power meant nothing if you couldn't control your own heart. So you did what cowards do. You hurt me first, before I could hurt you." Draven stared at her, and for the first time in his life had no response. Because she was right. Every word. He'd told himself pretty lies about duty and sacrifice and what kings couldn't afford. But underneath all of it, the truth was simpler and uglier. He'd been afraid. Afraid of loving her, afraid of needing her, afraid of being the kind of king his father would have called weak. "I want to know him," Draven said finally. "Please." Celine studied him for a long moment. Around them, the market continued its ordinary chaos. Vendors hawked goods. Children played. Life moved forward, indifferent to royal drama. "Why now?" she asked. "Why not 4 years ago when I was alone and desperate and would have given anything to hear you say you cared?" "Because I was a fool. You're still a fool." She shook her head. "But you're a fool asking instead of commanding, which I suppose is progress." She turned away, then paused. "Tomorrow. Noon. The clearing by the eastern pine grove. You can meet him. Properly. But understand this, Draven. Her use of his name instead of title felt deliberate. You don't get to be a king here. You don't get to decree your way into his life. You earn it, day by day, moment by moment, like anyone else. How long? As long as it takes." She walked away, leaving him standing in the market square with a chance he didn't deserve and no idea how to use it. The clearing was peaceful. Pine trees filtered sunlight into golden streams. A creek babbled nearby. The kind of place that existed far from thrones and crowns and the weight of empire. Lucien arrived first, holding Celine's hand and looking around with excited curiosity. He wore simple clothes, carried his wooden horse, and had no idea he was about to meet the most powerful man in the kingdom. Draven stepped into the clearing and the boy's silver eyes locked onto him with unnerving intelligence. "Hello, Lucien," Draven said, his voice rough with emotions he didn't know how to name. "Hello," the boy replied politely. "Mama says you're a friend." Draven glanced at Celine. She met his gaze with a look that clearly said, "Don't make me a liar." "I'd like to be," Draven said carefully. "What's your name?" The question was so innocent, so normal. And Draven realized he couldn't answer honestly. Not yet. Not when the truth would shatter this fragile moment. "You can call me Drav," he said. Lucien considered this. "That's a strong name, like a warrior." Something in Draven's chest twisted. like a warrior. If only the boy knew. Do you want to see my horse? Lucian held up the carved toy. I'd be honored. For the next hour, Draven sat on the forest floor and listened to his 4-year-old son explain the intricate adventures of a wooden horse. He learned about mountain bandits and dragon caves and brave knights. He heard Lucien's laugh, watched his expressions, saw Celine's kindness and his own stubborn intensity blended in one remarkable child. And he understood with brutal clarity exactly what he'd lost when he'd chosen fear over love. This simple joy, this connection, this moment that no amount of power could purchase or command. When Celine finally said they needed to go, Lucien hugged Draven with the unconscious affection of a child who didn't yet know how to guard his heart. Will you come back tomorrow? The boy asked. Draven looked at Celine. She nodded slightly. Yes, he promised. Tomorrow. As they walked away, Lucien turned back once and waved. Draven waved back, watching until they disappeared into the trees. Then he sat alone in the clearing and let himself feel everything he'd been avoiding for 4 years. The grief, the regret, the desperate, aching love for a child he barely knew and a woman he'd never stopped wanting. Kings aren't supposed to cry. But Draven wasn't a king in that moment. He was just a father who'd finally realized what he'd thrown away, and a man who had no idea how to get it back. Well, the days developed a rhythm. Mornings, Draven helped with odd jobs around the settlement, repairing fences, chopping wood, physical labor that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. The locals didn't know who he was, and he preferred it that way. Afternoons belonged to Lucien. They met in the clearing, and Draven taught his son things that had nothing to do with ruling kingdoms. How to balance a stick for sword practice, how to skip stones across the creek, how to identify animal tracks and read the sky for weather. Lucien absorbed everything with eager intelligence, asking questions that often pierced straight to uncomfortable truths. Why don't you live here? I have work elsewhere. Do you miss your family? Every day. Do you have a little boy where you work? No, just you. Evenings were harder, watching Celine from a distance, seeing her tuck Lucien into bed, knowing she did this every night without him, knowing he had no right to be part of it, but wanting it with an intensity that scared him. On the 7th day, Mara Thorne cornered him outside her inn. You're him, she said without preamble. The bastard who broke her. Draven met her gaze steadily. Yes. You planning to break her again? No. Mara snorted. Men like you always plan not to. Then something more important comes up, something that matters more than a woman's heart or a child's need, something that lets you justify being selfish and calling it duty. The words stung because they were accurate. I was wrong, Draven said quietly. Wrong is forgetting someone's birthday. Wrong is burning dinner. What you did was cruel. Mara stepped closer, and despite being half his size, she seemed imposing. That girl came here broken, pregnant, terrified. No money, no family, nothing but the clothes she wore and a purse of gold that felt like payment for being disposable. I watched her build herself back from that, watched her become strong, watched her raise that boy to be kind despite learning from you that powerful people discard what they claim to love. Draven's throat felt tight. I know, do you? Mara's eyes were fierce. Because from where I stand, you're a man playing house in the woods, pretending to be humble, pretending to understand. But sooner or later, your real life will call. And when it does, will you choose them? Or will you choose whatever let you abandon them the first time? I don't know, Draven admitted, and the honesty felt like bleeding. Mara studied him for a long moment. At least you're not lying. That's something. She turned to go, then paused. She loves you, you know. Still, despite everything, despite what you deserve. So if you're going to leave again, do it now, before the boy gets attached, before she lets herself hope, because the second time you break her, it'll kill something in her that can't be fixed. She walked away, leaving Draven standing in the street with a truth he couldn't escape. Celine still loved him, and he had no idea what to do with that, except try not to destroy it again. On the 12th day, everything changed. Draven was teaching Lucien to fish when the boy asked the question that shattered pretense. Drav, why do you have the same eyes as me? Draven's hands stilled on the fishing line. Celine, sitting nearby and reading, went rigid. What do you mean? Draven asked carefully. Silver eyes. Mama says they're special. She says I got them from someone brave. Lucien looked up with innocent curiosity. Did you know someone brave who had eyes like ours? The clearing fell silent, except for the creek's endless murmur. Draven looked at Celine. She was watching him with an expression that said, "This is your moment. Choose carefully." He could lie, could deflect, could buy more time in this comfortable fiction where he was just Drav, a friendly stranger who liked spending time with a smart little boy. But sitting there, looking into eyes that mirrored his own, Draven realized he was done lying. Lucien, he said slowly, do you know what it means to be someone's father? The boy frowned, thinking, it means you take care of them, and teach them things, and love them even when they're bad. That's right. Draven's heart hammered against his ribs, and sometimes fathers make terrible mistakes. Sometimes they get scared and do things that hurt the people they should protect. Did your father do that? Yes. Lucien's expression turned sympathetic in the way only children can manage. That's sad. Very sad. The boy reached out and patted Draven's hand with his small fingers. It's okay. You can be better now. The simple forgiveness destroyed him. Draven looked at Celine again. She had tears streaming down her face, silent and steady. He turned back to Lucien and made a choice that terrified him more than any battlefield. I want to tell you something important, he said, and I need you to listen carefully. The boy nodded seriously. My name isn't really Drav, it's Draven, and He swallowed hard. I am your father. Lucien blinked. You are? Yes. Where have you been? Making mistakes, being scared, hurting your mother and missing you when I didn't even know I should be missing you. The boy processed this with the gravity of childhood. Are you going to leave again? And there it was. The question that mattered, the choice that would define everything. Draven could feel the weight of his kingdom pressing down. His counsel, his duties, the crown that demanded sacrifice, all of it waiting beyond these pine trees, ready to pull him back into the life he'd built on control and isolation. But looking at his son's silver eyes, he understood something his father never had. Power that requires you to abandon your humanity isn't power. It's a prison. No, Draven said firmly. I'm not leaving. Promise? I promise. Lucien smiled, and it was like watching the sunrise. Okay. Can I call you Papa instead of Drav? Draven's voice broke. Yes, please. The boy turned back to his fishing line, the matter settled with the beautiful simplicity of childhood. Draven looked at Celine over their son's head. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. Wonder, fear, hope, anger, everything mixed together. Can we talk? He asked quietly. She nodded. They left Lucien fishing under Mara's supervision and walked deeper into the forest until the sound of the settlement faded to nothing. Then Celine turned on him with the fury he'd been expecting for 12 days. How dare you? What? How dare you make him that promise? Her voice shook. How dare you look him in the eyes and swear you won't leave when we both know your real life is waiting? You're a king, Draven. You don't get to play pretend in the woods forever. I'm not playing. Yes, you are, she shouted now, 4 years of pain erupting. You're playing at being humble, playing at being a father, playing at being someone who chooses people over power. But eventually, something will happen. Some crisis, some threat to your precious kingdom. And you'll go back. You'll put on your crown and make your speeches about duty and sacrifice, and we'll be left here wondering why we were stupid enough to believe you changed. I have changed. No, you've hidden. There's a difference. Celine was crying now, angry tears that she swiped at furiously. Change is facing the hard choices. Change is standing in front of your court and claiming us. Change is risking your crown for your family. Hiding in the woods and teaching our son to fish isn't change. It's cowardice with better scenery. The words hit like arrows, each one finding its mark. Because she was right. He'd been hiding, pretending that he could somehow have both, his kingdom and his family, his power and his love, his crown and his humanity. But life didn't work that way. Eventually, he'd have to choose. "What do you want from me?" he asked, and his voice was raw. "I want you to want us more than you want your throne." Celine stepped closer. "I want you to be willing to give it all up if that's what it takes. I want you to love us enough that choosing us isn't even a question, and if I can't, then you need to leave now. Before Lucien gets more attached, before I let myself hope again, before we all pretend this can end any way but badly." Draven looked at her, really looked, at the woman who'd survived his abandonment and built strength from wreckage, at the mother who'd raised his son alone, at the person who'd loved him when he was too much of a coward to love himself, and he realized the truth that had been waiting all along. He couldn't have both. Eventually, he'd have to choose between his crown and his heart, between the kingdom he'd built and the family he'd destroyed, between power and love. The question was which one he'd choose when the moment came, and standing there in the forest with Celine's tears on her cheeks and his son's promise still echoing in his ears, Draven honestly didn't know, which terrified him more than any enemy army ever had, because for the first time in his life, he understood what was really at stake. Not a kingdom, not power, not legacy, just three people trying to survive the damage one of them had caused. And the clock was ticking. Somewhere in Vareth, his council was making decisions without him. Rival houses were maneuvering, threats were building. Soon, very soon, his two lives would collide. And when they did, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the moment. Draven's guards burst through the trees, their faces grim. "Your Majesty," the lead guard said, and Celine's expression froze at the title. "We have urgent news from the capital. The council has discovered your location. They're sending a regiment to retrieve you, and," he hesitated, "they've learned about the child." Draven's blood turned to ice. "How long?" "They'll be here by tomorrow noon." Celine stared at him. "Your Majesty," she whispered. The guards realized their mistake too late, and in that moment Draven understood. His time was up. The two lives had just collided, and tomorrow the entire kingdom would learn that their alpha king had a bastard son hidden in a frontier village. Tomorrow, everything would burn. The forest seemed to shrink around them. Three people frozen in a tableau of revelation and dread. Celine staring at Draven with dawning horror, the guard shifting uncomfortably. And Draven himself, caught between the man he'd been pretending to be and the king he'd never stopped being. "Your Majesty," Celine repeated, and the words sounded like an accusation. "You're the king." It wasn't a question. Draven opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he say? That he'd meant to tell her? That the deception had started as protection and metastasized into cowardice? That he'd been hiding not just his identity, but his entire life because the truth would shatter this fragile piece they'd built? All of it true. None of it enough. "Your King Draven Morcant," Celine said slowly, each word dropping like a stone into still water. "The Lion of the North. The man who rules half the continent. And you've been here for 2 weeks pretending to be nobody." "I wasn't pretending about what matters." "What matters?" Her laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. "You let me talk to you like an equal. You sat on the ground with our son and played with wooden horses while your council runs a kingdom. You made promises about not leaving when you have an entire empire waiting for you to come home. I meant those promises." "Did you?" She stepped closer and he could see fury and betrayal warring in her eyes. "Or were you just playing dress-up, slumming with the commoners before going back to your throne?" "Tell me, Your Majesty," she spat the title like poison. "Was this whole thing some kind of royal fantasy? Powerful king discovers he has a heart, spends a few weeks pretending he's human, then goes back to reality feeling noble about himself? That's not what this was." "Then what was it?" Draven looked at his guards. "Leave us." "Sire, we really should—" That wasn't a request. The guards retreated, but not far. Close enough to intervene if their king needed protection. From an unarmed woman. The absurdity of it would have been funny if everything wasn't actively falling apart. Celine waited, arms crossed, every line of her body radiating rage. "I came here to meet my son," Draven said quietly. "To fix what I broke. To try to be the father I should have been 4 years ago. As a king or as a man?" "What?" She moved closer, relentless. "Did you come here planning to claim us publicly? To bring us back to your palace and face your court? Or were you planning to keep us as your little secret? Visit when convenient. Support us from a distance. Have your family and your power without ever having to choose between them?" The accuracy of her words felt like a blade between his ribs. Because that's the real question, isn't it? Celine's voice dropped to something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. You say you've changed. You say you want us. But what you actually want is for this to be easy, for us to fit neatly into your life without disrupting it, for love to be convenient. That's not fair. Fair? She laughed again, bitter and broken. You want to talk about fair? I raised our son alone. I worked myself raw in a frontier inn. I answered his questions about why he didn't have a father while you sat on a throne making decisions about other people's lives. And now you show up wanting credit for 2 weeks of playing house? I'm trying. Trying isn't enough. Her composure cracked completely. Don't you understand? Tomorrow your soldiers arrive. Tomorrow the whole kingdom learns about Lucian. And what happens then? Do you claim him? Do you claim me? Or do you apologize to your council and explain that you had a moment of weakness, but you're back now and everything's under control? Draven felt anger surge in response. Not at her, at himself, at the situation, at the impossible choices bearing down on him like an avalanche. I don't know, he said, and the admission cost him. I don't know what happens tomorrow. Well, that's honest, at least. They stood there in the forest, two people who'd created a life together but couldn't figure out how to live in the same world. Tell me something, Celine said finally. When you were lying in bed last night, what were you planning? Really planning? Not the fantasy, the reality. Draven wanted to lie. Wanted to tell her he had it all figured out. That he'd worked out how to be both king and father, ruler and lover, alpha and human. But she deserved truth, even if it destroyed them. I was planning to take you both back to Vareth, he said slowly. Quietly. Like someone confessing to murder. I was planning to legitimize Lucian, make him my heir, give you a place in the palace. And me? Celine asked. What place exactly? Mistress? Servant? The Omega who trapped a king? No. Then what? I don't know. His voice was raw. The court would never accept you as queen. You have no bloodline, no political value, no training for the role. So I'd be what? Your secret? Your shame? The woman you keep around for your son's sake? Stop. Why? She was crying now, angry tears that carved tracks down her face. Why should I stop? You need to hear this. You need to understand what you're actually asking. You want me to come back to the place that taught me I was disposable. You want our son to grow up in a court that will view him as a bastard who stole a throne from legitimate heirs. You want us to live in the shadow of your power, grateful for whatever scraps of attention you can spare between ruling an empire. That's not what I want. Then what do you want? You! The word exploded out of him. I want you. I want Lucian. I want mornings where I wake up next to you instead of alone in a room the size of a house. I want to teach our son to be better than I was. I want to be the man I was pretending to be for the last 2 weeks instead of the king I've been for the last decade. Celine stared at him. Wanting it isn't enough. Anyone can want. Wanting costs nothing. Then tell me what does. Tell me what it takes to fix this. There is no fixing this. Her voice broke. Don't you see? You're a king. I'm nobody. Lucien is your son, but he's also my entire world. You have duties and obligations and an empire depending on you. I have a life I built from nothing, and I will not let you destroy it again just because you've decided you have feelings. The words hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. And Draven understood. She didn't trust him. Why would she? Every promise he'd made, he'd broken. Every time she'd believed in him, he'd let her down. 2 weeks of playing father couldn't erase 4 years of abandonment. Trust wasn't won with words, it was earned through choices. And tomorrow he'd have to make the biggest choice of his life. His kingdom or his family, his crown or his heart, power or love. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for an answer he didn't have. What do you want me to do? He asked quietly. Celine met his eyes, and in them he saw the woman who'd survived him once and would survive him again if necessary. I want you to leave, she said. Tomorrow when your soldiers come, I want you to go back to your palace and your throne and your life. And I want you to forget about us. No. Yes. Her voice was firm. Because if you stay, if you try to bring us into your world, it will destroy us. Lucien will become a pawn in political games. I'll become the Omega who seduced a king, and you'll resent us for being the weakness your enemies exploit. That won't happen. It already is happening, don't you see? The moment your guards found us, the moment your council learned about Lucian, we became leverage. We became the thing your rivals will use against you, and you'll have to choose between protecting us and protecting your kingdom. She shook her head. I won't do that to you. I won't be the reason your empire falls. The nobility in her sacrifice made it worse somehow. She was trying to save him by destroying herself. And Draven realized with brutal clarity that this was the pattern. This was what they did. He pushed her away to protect his power. She pulled away to protect his conscience. They both made sacrifices that served no one and saved nothing. What if I abdicate? He said suddenly. Celine blinked. What? What if I give up the throne? Make my brother king. Walk away from all of it. You can't do that. Why not? Because you're not that person. Her voice was gentle now, which somehow hurt more than her anger. You're an alpha king. Ruling is in your blood. Command is your nature. You'd resent us within a year, maybe less. You'd look at Lucian and see the crown you sacrificed. You'd look at me and remember the empire you lost. You don't know that. Yes, I do, because I know you. The real you. Not the man who's been playing farmer in the woods. The king who conquers provinces and crushes rebellions and makes decisions that affect millions. That's who you are. And I won't ask you to destroy that. What if I want to? Celine stepped close enough to touch, reached up and cupped his face with one hand. Her palm was warm against his cheek, calloused from work. Real in a way palace softness never was. Then you're lying to yourself, she whispered. And I'm done being lied to, even when the lies sound like love. She dropped her hand and stepped back. Go home, Draven. Be the king you were born to be. Let us be the family we've learned to be without you. And if I refuse, then you're no better than you were 4 years ago. Still taking what you want without counting the cost. The truth of it hit like a war hammer to the chest, because she was right. If he forced this, if he dragged them back to Vareth against her wishes, he'd be using power to override consent. Crown to crush choice. The same thing he'd done when he dismissed her with a purse of gold and orders to disappear. Different method. Same cruelty. The realization that he could hurt her by staying just as much as by leaving was possibly the worst thing he'd ever learned. Footsteps approached. The guard appeared urgent and nervous. Your Majesty, he said quietly. The boy is asking for you. Draven closed his eyes. Lucien. He'd promised his son he wouldn't leave. He'd sworn it. And now he had perhaps 12 hours before that promise became a lie. Let me see him, Draven said, one more time. Then I'll decide. Celine nodded, exhausted. One more time. But tomorrow, you choose. Kingdom or family. Power or love. And whatever you choose, you live with it. No more hiding. No more pretending you can have both. She walked away, leaving him standing in the forest with the weight of an empire pressing down on his shoulders and the ghost of her touch still warm on his face. Tomorrow. Everything would change tomorrow. The only question was whether he had the courage to choose what mattered over what was easy. And standing there alone, Draven honestly didn't know the answer. That night, Draven sat with Lucien in the clearing under a sky full of stars. The boy had asked to camp out, and Celine had agreed with the weary resignation of someone who knew these might be their last hours together. She stayed nearby, close enough to protect but far enough to give them space. Papa, Lucian said, pointing at constellations he'd learned from Mara. That's the hunter, and that's the queen. Do you know the stories? Some of them, Draven said quietly. Tell me. So Draven told his son stories. His own father had told him before cruelty had calcified into tradition. Stories about heroes and monsters, choices and consequences, the price of power and the cost of pride. Lucien listened with rapt attention, silver eyes reflecting starlight. Papa, the boy said eventually, why do the heroes always have to be alone? What do you mean? In the stories. The kings and warriors. They're always alone. No family, no one who loves them. Just their duty. Draven's throat tightened. I don't know. I think it's sad. Lucian snuggled closer. If I was a king, I'd want my family with me. What's the point of being powerful if you're lonely? Out of the mouths of children came the wisdom that broke kingdoms. What if being a king meant you couldn't have a family? Draven asked carefully. What if you had to choose? Lucian frowned, thinking hard. Then I wouldn't want to be a king. Just like that. Simple, obvious. The thing Draven had spent 4 years avoiding because it meant admitting his entire life had been built on a lie. You'd give up being powerful? Power isn't real, Lucian said with the absolute certainty of a 4-year-old. Mama says the only real things are people who love you and choices you can live with. Celene's teaching. Celene's wisdom. Celene's strength raising a son who understood more about life at 4 than Draven had learned in 32 years. Your mama is very smart. She says you are too. But that you're scared. Draven's breath caught. She said that? Not with words. But I can tell. You have the same look she gets sometimes, like you want to hold on to something but you're afraid it'll break. The accuracy destroyed him. What if I told you I have to leave tomorrow? Draven asked, hating himself for the question. Lucian's face fell. But you promised. I know. Promises are important. The boy's voice was small. Mama says promises are how people trust each other. She's right. So if you leave after you promised, that means you don't want us to trust you? The logic was flawless, the judgment absolute. Draven looked at his son and saw the future laid out with perfect clarity. If he left tomorrow, Lucian would remember this moment for the rest of his life. The night his father looked him in the eyes and explained that promises don't matter when something more important comes up. The lesson that love is conditional, that family is disposable, that power trumps everything. His father had taught Draven that lesson. It had poisoned his entire life, and now he was about to pass that same poison to his son. No, Draven said firmly. I want you to trust me, very much. Then don't leave. It's more complicated than that. Why? Because he paused, because I have responsibilities. To who? To a lot of people. Lucian processed this. More people than me and Mama? Different people. Do you love them? The question was so innocent, so devastating. Not the way I love you, then why do they matter more? Draven had no answer, because there wasn't one. Not one that would satisfy a child's logic, not one that would satisfy his own conscience. He'd built his entire identity on the idea that kings serve the many over the few, that personal happiness is sacrificed for the greater good, that love is weakness and attachment is vulnerability. But sitting there with his son's small hand in his and Selene watching from the shadows, Draven understood the flaw in that philosophy. Serving the many doesn't require abandoning the few. Greater good doesn't demand personal destruction. Love isn't weakness. Fear of love is, and he'd been afraid for so long that he'd forgotten what courage actually looked like. Lucian, Draven said slowly, if I could give you anything in the world, what would you want? The boy didn't hesitate. I want you to stay, and I want Mama to stop being sad, and I want us to be a family. What if that was hard? What if people didn't like it? I don't care what people like. Mama says you can't control what other people think. You can only control what you do. More of Celene's wisdom. More truth from a woman who'd learned through suffering what Draven had avoided through power. You're very smart, Draven said quietly. Mama says I get that from you. Lucian smiled. But she says I get my heart from her. The kid had no idea how accurate that was. Draven pulled his son close, held him against his chest, and felt something crack open inside him. 4 years of justification, decades of conditioning, generations of tradition about what kings could and couldn't do. All of it crumbling beneath the simple truth that his 4-year-old understood better than any advisor. Love matters. Everything else is negotiable. Papa, Lucian said sleepily, are you crying? Yes. Why? Because I just figured something out. What? How to be brave. The boy fell asleep in his father's arms, trusting and innocent, with no idea that the decision being made would reshape kingdoms. Selene approached quietly, settling beside them. For a long time they sat in silence. 3 people under an ocean of stars. A family that shouldn't exist by any political logic, but existed anyway, because biology and bad choices had conspired to create it. I'm not leaving, Draven said finally. Selene turned to look at him. What? Tomorrow when my soldiers arrive, I'm not going back. Not without you. Not without him. Draven, you can't. Yes, I can. He met her eyes. You were right. About everything. I've been trying to have both. Trying to be king and father without choosing. But that's cowardice. That's me asking you to live in my shadow while I pretend I'm being noble. So what are you saying? I'm saying you and Lucien come first. Not the kingdom. Not my crown. Not my legacy. You. She stared at him like he'd lost his mind. You'll start a civil war. The noble houses won't accept a common-born queen and a bastard heir. Then they'll have to kill me to stop it. His voice was calm. Certain. I spent 4 years being the king my father wanted. It made me powerful and miserable. I spent 2 weeks being the father I should be. It made me human. I know which one I choose. Tears were streaming down Celine's face. You'll lose everything. I already lost everything once when I sent you away. I'm not doing it again. What about your brother, the succession? Garrett can have it. He's always wanted the throne anyway. He'll be a good king, probably better than me. The council will call it treason. Let them. Your enemies will say you abandoned your duty. My duty is to the people I love. Everything else is just theater. Celine was shaking. This is insane. Completely. Draven reached for her hand. But I've tried sanity. I've tried logic. I've tried ruling through dominance and sacrificing the personal for the political. It made me the kind of man who throws away his pregnant lover because he's too afraid of gossip. He squeezed her fingers gently. I'm done being that man. She looked at their sleeping son, then at Draven, then at the stars. They'll never stop coming for us, she said quietly. Every rival house, every ambitious lord, every person who sees Lucien as illegitimate. We'll spend our lives fighting, then we fight, together. I don't want to be queen, you don't have to be, we'll find another way. Maybe I step down. Maybe we leave Vareth entirely. Maybe we build something new that doesn't require choosing between love and duty. You really mean this? It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. Every word. Celine leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, and they sat that way until dawn started painting the eastern sky. When the sun rose, Draven knew exactly what he was going to do, and for the first time in 4 years, he wasn't afraid. The soldiers arrived at noon. 50 mounted warriors in full royal regalia, banners snapping in the wind, armor polished to mirror brightness. The kind of display meant to remind frontier settlements that the crown's reach was absolute. At their head rode Chancellor Malus, looking grim and determined. The settlement gathered to watch. Nobody knew what was happening, but armed soldiers meant trouble, and trouble attracted attention. Draven stood in front of the inn with Celine beside him, and Lucien holding both their hands. Behind them, Mara Thorne stood with arms crossed, looking like she was ready to fight 50 soldiers with nothing but attitude and a kitchen knife. The Chancellor dismounted, walked forward, and stopped 10 feet away. Your Majesty, he said formally, the Council demands your immediate return to Vareth. No. The single word rang out across the square. Malus blinked. Excuse me? You heard me? I'm not going back. Not yet. Not on those terms. Sire, the Council has been quite clear. Your absence is causing instability. He glanced at Celine and Lucien with barely concealed distaste. Situation has created a succession crisis. You must return and address it. I will address it. In my own time. On my own terms. That is unacceptable. Then the Council can learn to accept the unacceptable. Draven's voice carried the edge that made generals nervous. I am still king. My word is still law. And I say I'm staying. For how long? As long as it takes. The Chancellor's face darkened. You would abandon your kingdom for, he paused, for them? Yes. The crowd gasped. Even Celine looked shocked. Malus recovered quickly. Then I must inform your Majesty that if you do not return within the day, the Council will be forced to consider alternative succession. You're threatening to depose me. We're threatening nothing. We're stating reality. A king who abandons his throne forfeits his claim to it. Draven smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Funny. I don't remember abandoning anything. I remember being here, conducting royal business, and finding out I have a son. A bastard, someone in the crowd of soldiers muttered. Draven's head snapped toward the sound. His entire demeanor changed. The man disappeared. The alpha emerged, pure dominant fury that made horses shy and soldiers take involuntary steps backward. "Say that again," he said quietly, dangerously. Silence. "No?" Draven looked across the assembled soldiers. "Anyone else want to call my son a bastard? Anyone want to question his legitimacy? Because I'm standing right here, and I'm very interested in having that conversation." Nobody moved. Draven turned back to Malus. "You will return to Vareth. You will inform the council that I acknowledge Draven Morcant as my son and heir. You will prepare chambers for him and his mother, and you will make it very clear that anyone who has a problem with this can address it with me personally." Malus looked like he'd swallowed something sour. "The court will never accept her as queen. Then perhaps we need a new court. That's treason. That's evolution." Draven's voice was calm. "Absolute. I have spent my entire reign doing what the noble houses wanted. Marrying their daughters was supposed to happen. Following their traditions was expected. Sacrificing my personal life for political stability was demanded. And I'm done. You'll fracture the kingdom. Then I'll reforge it. Stronger. Better. Without the rot that says bloodline matters more than character." He looked at Celine, at Lucien, at the life he'd almost lost because tradition mattered more than truth. "Tell the council I'll return in 1 month," Draven said. "That gives them time to adjust, time to accept reality, and time for anyone who can't accept it to make their position clear. And if they refuse, then I'll know who my real enemies are." The Chancellor stared at him for a long moment. "You've changed," he said quietly. "Yes, I have. I'm not certain it's an improvement. I don't care." Malus looked like he wanted to argue. Then he saw something in Draven's eyes, some absolute certainty that made further discussion pointless. "Very well," he said stiffly. 1 month. But know this, Your Majesty, what you're attempting has never been done. An Omega Queen, a common-born royal. You're rewriting every tradition that holds the kingdom together." "Good." Draven's smile was sharp. Maybe those traditions needed rewriting. The Chancellor mounted his horse, signaled the soldiers, and rode out without another word. The settlement erupted in confused chatter. Draven looked down at Lucien, whose eyes were huge. "Papa," the boy whispered, "are you really a king?" "Yes." "Do I have to be a king too?" "Someday. If you want." "What if I don't?" Draven knelt down, eye level with his son. "Then you don't. The crown doesn't own you. It serves you. Never forget that." He looked up at Celine. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You just declared war on your entire kingdom," she said quietly. "Yes?" "Why?" "Because some things are worth fighting for." He stood, reached for her hand. "And some people are worth burning the world to protect." Mara Thorne snorted from behind them. "About damn time you figured that out." The settlement was still buzzing with excitement and confusion. Draven knew he should address them, should explain what just happened, should smooth over the disruption his presence had caused. But looking at Celine and Lucien, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he didn't care what anyone else thought. He'd made his choice: kingdom or family, power or love, crown or heart. He'd chosen. And whatever came next, whatever price he had to pay, whatever battles he had to fight, he'd do it knowing he'd finally done the one brave thing that mattered. He'd chosen the people he loved over the image he'd built. He'd chosen humanity over dominance. He'd chosen to be the father Lucien deserved instead of the king his court demanded. The consequences would be brutal. The political fallout would be catastrophic. The noble houses would sharpen their knives and plot rebellion. But standing there with his family beside him and his decision made, Draven felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of purpose. He was done hiding, done pretending, done sacrificing what mattered for what was easy. Tomorrow he'd start planning their return to Vareth. Tomorrow he'd begin the fight to reshape a kingdom. Tomorrow the real war would begin. But today, right now, in this moment, he was exactly where he needed to be, with the woman he loved and the son he'd almost lost, and the future he'd finally chosen to claim. Celine squeezed his hand. "What happens now?" she asked. Draven looked at the horizon, at the road that led back to Vareth, and everything waiting there. Now, he said quietly, we figure out how to build a kingdom that doesn't require us to destroy ourselves to sustain it. It was an impossible task. A battle no one had ever won. A revolution that would cost everything. But looking at Lucian's trusting smile and Celine's cautious hope, Draven knew one thing with absolute certainty. It was worth it. All of it. Every sacrifice, every battle, every enemy he'd have to face. Because some wars aren't fought for territory or power. Some wars are fought for the right to love without fear. And this one, this war against tradition and expectation and everything that said he couldn't choose his family over his crown, this war he would win. Or die trying. There was no third option. Not anymore. The month passed like a held breath. Draven used the time to prepare Celine and Lucien for what waited in Vareth. He taught his son the basics of court etiquette, how to stand straight under scrutiny, how to meet hostile eyes without flinching. He walked Celine through the labyrinth of palace politics, mapping out the factions that would support them and the ones that would sharpen knives in the dark. But preparation only goes so far when you're walking into a war. The journey back took 5 days. They traveled with a small escort, Draven refusing the spectacle of a royal procession. Lucien rode in front of his father, eyes wide as they passed through villages and towns where people gathered to glimpse their king. Celine rode beside them, silent and watchful, her expression revealing nothing. On the 4th night, camped in a clearing off the main road, she finally spoke what had been building between them. They're going to try to separate us? Draven looked up from the fire. I know, the moment we arrive, they'll say Lucien Dati. It's proper education. That I need training. That we can't possibly share your chambers until after a formal marriage. She stared into the flames. They'll use every tradition, every protocol, every rule to drive wedges between us. Let them try. You're not listening. Celine's voice was sharp. These people have been playing this game since birth. They know exactly how to destroy what you're trying to build, and they'll do it with smiles and protocol and concern for propriety. Then we don't play by their rules. We have to. That's the point. You can't just rewrite everything overnight. The court won't accept it. The noble houses will rebel. Your own guards might turn on you. Draven stood, moved to sit beside her, put his hand over hers. 4 years ago, I sent you away because I was afraid of what they'd think. I'm done letting fear make my decisions. Whatever happens, we face it together. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the same doubt that lived in his own chest, because the truth was simpler and uglier than either wanted to admit. They were walking into a trap, and the only question was whether love could survive what politics was about to do to it. Vareth rose from the plains like a promise and a threat. White marble towers catching afternoon sun, obsidian walls that had never fallen, banners streaming from battlements that had watched empires rise and collapse. The capital gleamed with power and permanence, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. Lucien pressed back against Draven's chest. It's so big, the boy whispered. Yes. Are all those people going to stare at me? Probably. I don't like it. Draven tightened his arm around his son. I know. But you don't have to like it. You just have to survive it. The gates opened and they rode through streets lined with crowds, curious faces, hostile whispers, people straining to catch a glimpse of the common-born woman and bastard child who'd somehow captured their king. The word bastard followed them like a stain. Draven felt Celine flinch every time she heard it, felt Lucien's small body tense with confusion and hurt, and he understood with brutal clarity that bringing them here might be the cruelest thing he'd ever done, because no amount of royal decree could change what these people believed. Bloodline mattered, station mattered, everything else was just theater. The palace courtyard filled with advisors and nobles, all arranged in careful hierarchy. At the center stood Chancellor Malus, flanked by the most powerful lords in the kingdom. Their expressions ranged from barely concealed contempt to cold calculation. This was the gauntlet, the first test. Draven dismounted, then helped Celine down. She held Lucien's hand so tightly the boy winced. Your Majesty, Malus said formally, welcome home. The word home landed like an accusation. Thank you, Chancellor. Draven kept his voice level. I trust everything has been prepared as I requested. Indeed. Chambers have been arranged for the child in the East Wing. Separate quarters for, he paused delicately, the woman, have been prepared in the servants' section until such time as her status can be formalized. The trap sprung immediately. Servants' section. Not guest quarters, not noble chambers. Servants. A deliberate insult wrapped in protocol. Draven felt rage spike hot and immediate. No. Malys raised an eyebrow. Your Majesty? Lady Selene will be housed in the royal wing, adjacent to my chambers. That would be highly irregular. I don't care. The court would view it as scandalous. The court can view it however they damn well please. She stays with me. A murmur rippled through the assembled nobles. Scandalized whispers. Knowing looks. The kind of gossip that would spread through the palace like poison. Lord Rothland stepped forward. An older noble, powerful family, deep connections. His smile was polite and venomous. Your Majesty, surely you understand our concern. The woman's position is delicate. Until a proper investigation into the child's parentage can be conducted, it would be prudent to maintain certain proprieties. Investigation? Draven's voice dropped to something dangerous. What investigation? Merely a formality. Rothland's tone suggested anything but. To establish legitimacy. Confirm bloodlines. Ensure that the succession is secure. My son's bloodline is confirmed by my word. With all respect, sire, your word in this matter may be compromised. Emotional attachment can cloud judgment. The implication was clear. They thought Selene had seduced him, trapped him, used her Omega nature to manipulate an Alpha King into claiming a child that might not even be his. The insult was so profound, so calculated, that for a moment Draven couldn't even speak. Selene could. If you doubt my son's paternity, she said clearly, then conduct your investigation. Test his blood. Examine him however you see fit. But do it quickly and do it once, because I will not have him subjected to a lifetime of this. Her voice was steady, proud. The voice of a woman who'd survived worse than noble contempt. Rothland smiled. How very reasonable. We shall begin immediately. No. Draven found his voice. There will be no investigation, no testing, no bureaucratic harassment disguised as procedure. Lucien is my son, my heir, and anyone who questions that questions me. The courtyard went silent. Malys cleared his throat. Your Majesty, perhaps we should continue this discussion in private. There's nothing to discuss. I must insist. The Chancellor's tone carried weight, not quite insubordination, close enough to make the point. Draven looked at Selene, at Lucien clinging to his mother's hand, at the 50 nobles watching with predatory interest. He could fight this battle here and now, could use raw authority to crush the challenge, could remind everyone exactly who held power in this kingdom. But that would mean exposing Selene and Lucien to the full cruelty of court politics on their first day. Fine, he said finally. Private chambers. 1 hour. He leaned close to Selene, whispered, Stay close to the guards. Don't let them separate you from Lucien. She nodded, fear flickering behind her eyes. Draven followed Malys into the palace, and with each step away from his family, he felt the trap closing tighter. The council chamber was exactly as he remembered. Dark wood, heavy tapestries, a table large enough to seat 30 men who all believed they knew better than their king. Malys, Rothland, and 4 other high lords waited, the most powerful men in Vareth, the ones who controlled armies, trade routes, and the loyalty of lesser nobles, the ones who could make or break a king. Draven took his seat at the head of the table. Didn't wait for them to begin. Say what you came to say. Rothland spoke first. Your Majesty, we understand you formed an attachment to this woman and her child. My woman. My child. As you say. The Lord's smile never reached his eyes. However, you must understand our position. The kingdom requires stability, clear succession, established bloodlines. Lucien is my blood. You believe he is. But belief and proof are different things, and in matters of succession, proof is everything. I've given you proof. My word is king. Your word, Malys interjected quietly, is currently suspect. Draven's hands curled into fists beneath the table. Explain. You disappeared for a month, rejected your responsibilities, Threaten to abandon your throne for a woman you bedded 4 years ago and a child you've never mentioned until now. The Chancellor's voice was careful, clinical. This suggests emotional instability, poor judgment, potentially diminished capacity to rule. The words landed like hammer blows. They weren't just questioning Lucian's legitimacy, they were questioning his. You're suggesting I'm unfit to rule. We're suggesting you're compromised. There's a difference. And your solution? Rothlin leaned forward. A regency council, temporary, until you've recovered your equilibrium. We would handle the day-to-day governance while you take time to address your personal situation. Draven understood immediately. This was a coup. Soft, bloodless, wrapped in concern and protocol. But a coup nonetheless. They'd use his love for Celine as evidence of weakness, use Lucien as proof of poor judgment, strip away his authority piece by piece until he was king in name only while they ran the kingdom. And if he fought too hard, if he pushed back too violently, they'd claim it as further evidence of instability. The trap was perfect, brutally, beautifully perfect. No, Draven said quietly. Your Majesty. I said no. I am not compromised. I am not unstable. And I will not surrender my authority to a council of men who think bloodline matters more than character. This isn't about bloodline. Malus sounded almost sad. This is about the kingdom, about stability, about ensuring Vareth doesn't tear itself apart over succession. Then here's your stability. Draven stood, placed both hands flat on the table. Lucien is my heir. Celine will be my queen. Anyone who has a problem with that can challenge me directly. You would risk civil war over a woman? I would risk everything for my family. Rothlin's expression hardened. Then you're a fool. And fools don't keep crowns long. Is that a threat? It's reality. The Lord stood as well. You think you can force this? You think royal decree is enough? Half the noble houses are already preparing to rebel. The other half are waiting to see which way the wind blows. If you push this, you'll fracture the kingdom. Then it will fracture, and thousands will die. The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade, because Rothlin was right. If Draven forced this, if he tried to install Celine as queen and Lucien as heir against the wishes of the entire nobility, there would be war. Houses would choose sides, armies would mobilize, blood would run through streets and across battlefields, all because he loved a woman the court deemed unworthy. The calculation was brutal. His family or thousands of lives. His heart or his kingdom. The same choice, different consequences. You're bluffing, Draven said finally. Are we? Malus pulled a document from his robes. Read this. It was a petition, signed by 47 noble houses, requesting the formation of a regency council, citing concerns about the king's fitness to rule, demanding investigation into the Hollowmere situation. 47 houses. More than half the kingdom's power structure, all united against him. They'd been planning this, coordinating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And he'd walked right into it. You have two choices, Rothlin said quietly. Accept the regency, keep your crown, maintain peace, or fight us and watch the kingdom burn. Draven stared at the document, at the names of men he'd fought beside and ruled with, all arrayed against him now. And he understood. He'd lost. Not on the battlefield, not through military defeat, but through the same thing that had always destroyed him. Fear. His fear of loving Celine had created this mess 4 years ago. Their fear of change was weaponizing it now, and fear, Draven realized, was the one enemy he'd never learned to beat. I need time, he said hoarsely. You have until tomorrow. Malus stood. The council convenes at noon. We'll need your answer then. They filed out, leaving Draven alone in the chamber that suddenly felt like a tomb. He'd thought bringing Celine and Lucien here was brave. Turned out it was just stupid. Because bravery requires the power to protect what you love. And sitting there, surrounded by evidence of his own political impotence, Draven understood he had no power here at all, just a crown that felt heavier with each breath, and a choice that would destroy him either way. Besides, he found Celine in the chambers they'd assigned her. Not the servants' quarters, but not the royal wing either. Somewhere in between. Liminal space for a woman whose status was undecided. She was standing at the window, looking out over the city. Lucien slept in the adjoining room, exhausted by travel and stress. How bad? She asked without turning. Draven told her everything: the petition, the regency threat, the choice between his family and civil war. When he finished, she finally looked at him. "So we lost?" "Not yet." "Yes, we did." Her voice was flat, dead. The voice of someone who'd expected this and hurt anyway. "You can't fight 47 houses. You can't force an entire kingdom to accept us. We knew this would happen." "I can still fight. For what? So thousands die? So the kingdom tears itself apart? So our son grows up hated and hunted? He's my heir. He's a target." Celine moved away from the window. "Every ambitious lord will see him as an obstacle. Every rival house will plot his death. Every commoner who loses someone in the civil war will blame him for existing. I won't abandon you again. You have to." The words were quiet, final. Draven stared at her. "No." "Yes." She was crying now, silent tears that destroyed him. "Because this is the choice you were always going to face. Kingdom or family, power or love. And we both know which one wins. That's not—" "Stop. Just stop." Celine's voice broke. "I knew this would happen. I told you in Hollowmere. I told you bringing us here would destroy everything. But you didn't listen because you wanted to believe love could beat politics. It can." "No, it can't." She laughed, bitter and broken. "Love doesn't beat anything. It just makes you vulnerable, gives your enemies leverage, turns your heart into a weapon they can use against you." "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying we leave. Tonight, before the council meets tomorrow. We take Lucien and disappear." "Run away?" "Survive. There's a difference." Draven felt something crack inside his chest. "I won't do that. Then you're going to get us all killed." Her eyes were fierce. "Don't you understand? If you fight this, if you try to force the kingdom to accept us, we become the reason thousands die. Every mother who loses a son, every wife who loses a husband, every child orphaned by civil war. They'll all blame us. Let them." "I won't." Celine's voice was steel. "I won't let our son grow up knowing he caused that much death. I won't become the woman history blames for fracturing a kingdom. And I won't watch you destroy yourself trying to have both. So you'd rather disappear, pretend Lucien doesn't exist, raise him in hiding? I'd rather raise him alive." The truth of it hit like a blade between the ribs. She was right. She was absolutely right. Fighting would cost thousands of lives. Would turn Lucien into a symbol of division. Would paint Celine as the Omega who'd seduced a king and destroyed a kingdom. But accepting the regency meant surrendering. Meant admitting the court was right. Meant teaching Lucien that love loses to power every single time. Both choices were poison, just different flavors. "There has to be another way," Draven said desperately. "There isn't. This is the trap. This is what power does. It forces you to choose between the people you love and the people you rule. And there's no third option." She moved close, reached up to touch his face. "I love you," she whispered. "I never stopped. But I won't let you burn the world for us. Then what do? You let us go. You accept the regency. You keep your kingdom and live without you? Without him? Yes, that's not living. That's just existing." "Then exist." Celine's tears were flowing freely now. "Exist and rule well and know that somewhere your son is safe and growing up without the weight of a crown trying to crush him." Draven pulled her close, held her against his chest, and felt everything he'd fought for slipping away. There had to be another option. Some strategy he hadn't considered. Some political maneuver that could salvage this. But sitting there with Celine in his arms and his sleeping son in the next room, Draven couldn't see it. He'd beaten rebellions, crushed invasions, expanded an empire, but he couldn't beat the one enemy that mattered, the collective will of people determined to preserve tradition at any cost. A soft knock interrupted them. Marathorn entered without waiting for permission. The innkeeper looked older somehow, harder. She'd insisted on traveling with them, claiming someone needed to keep Celine grounded. Now her expression suggested she'd heard everything. "You're both idiots," she said flatly. Draven and Celine stared at her. "You," Mara pointed at Draven. "You think authority solves everything. You," she turned to Celine. "You think surrender is the same as survival, and neither of you is seeing the actual problem, which is, you're playing their game." Mara sat down uninvited. "The court sets the rules. You follow them. They say bloodline matters. You try to prove Lucien's bloodline. They say station matters. You try to elevate Celine's station. You're letting them define the battlefield. What else can we do? Change the battlefield. The old woman's eyes were sharp. You're a king. You don't have to follow their rules. You make new ones. They'll rebel. Let them. Mara leaned forward. You think these noble houses are united? They hate each other. They're only working together because they see you as weak. So stop being weak. I'm trying. No, you're apologizing. You're asking permission to love your family. You're treating this like a negotiation. Mara's voice was hard. Kings don't negotiate, they command. And if people don't like it, they learn to like it, or they die trying to change it. That's tyranny. That's survival. She looked at both of them. You want to know why they're winning? Because they're willing to do whatever it takes. They'll lie, manipulate, turn your love into a weapon, and you're sitting here trying to be fair. So what do you suggest? Stop playing nice. Mara's smile was sharp. You've got the army. You've got the treasury. You've got the crown. Use them. Arrest the ringleaders. Seize their lands. Make an example brutal enough that everyone else thinks twice. Draven shook his head. That's not who I am. Then maybe you need to change who you are, because the man you're being right now is about to lose everything. The words landed in silence. Change who he was. Become the tyrant his father had been. Use force instead of reason. Fear instead of respect. It went against everything he'd tried to build. Everything he believed about leadership and honor and ruling with justice instead of brutality. But Mara had a point. The noble houses were using his decency against him. His reluctance to spill blood, his desire to be better than his father. They'd calculated correctly that he'd rather surrender than become a monster. And that calculation was costing him his family. I won't become my father, Draven said quietly. Then prepare to lose. Mara stood. Because that's the choice. Be the king they fear or be the king they destroy. There's no middle ground. She left them alone again. Celine was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. She's wrong, Draven said. There has to be another way. Does there? Yes. But even as he said it, doubt crept in like poison. Because what if Mara was right? What if the only way to protect his family was to embrace the very brutality he'd spent years trying to avoid? What if love required becoming a monster? The question kept him awake all night. By dawn, he still had no answer. Just a council meeting in 6 hours where he'd have to choose. Regency or rebellion, surrender or slaughter, family or kingdom. And somewhere in the darkness, a fourth option was forming. Dangerous, brutal, unforgivable, but possibly the only way to win. The question was whether he had the stomach to execute it, or whether choosing it would destroy the very thing he was trying to protect, his humanity. The clock ticked toward noon, and Draven Morcant, the Lion of the North, the unconquered king, sat in the darkness and prepared to do something he'd sworn he'd never do. Become exactly what everyone feared he was. Not for power, not for pride, but for the two people sleeping in the room down the hall who trusted him to protect them, even if protecting them meant destroying himself. The council chamber filled at noon exactly. 47 lords representing the most powerful houses in the kingdom. Men who controlled armies and trade routes and the loyalty of thousands. Men who'd signed their names to a petition demanding their king submit to oversight. Men who thought they'd already won. Draven entered last, and the room fell silent. He wore full royal regalia. Crown. Ceremonial armor polished to mirror brightness. The sword his grandfather had carried into battle. Every inch the conquering king they remembered from battlefield victories. But something in his eyes was different, colder, harder, the kind of cold that came from burning away everything soft and keeping only what survived fire. He took his seat at the head of the table, didn't wait for formalities. I've considered your petition. The lords exchanged glances. Rothland spoke first, his tone carefully respectful. And your decision, Your Majesty? Draven pulled the document from his robes, the one they'd presented yesterday. 47 signatures demanding a regency council. He set it on the table. Then he drew his sword and drove it through the parchment, pinning it to the wood with enough force that the entire table shuddered. The chamber erupted, shouts of outrage, chairs scraping back, hands reaching for weapons that protocol forbade in the king's presence. Draven didn't move, just sat there with his hand still on the sword hilt, watching them react. When the noise died down, he spoke quietly. No. The single word carried absolute finality. Malus recovered first. Your Majesty, you cannot simply... I can. I am. And anyone who disagrees can draw steel and settle it the old way. Silence crashed down, because the challenge was explicit. Ancient law said any lord could challenge the king to single combat if they believed him unfit to rule. Winner took the crown. Loser took a grave. It was a law nobody had invoked in 3 generations. Nobody stupid enough to challenge an alpha warrior king in his prime. Draven looked across the assembled nobles with predator eyes. 47 of you signed this document. 47 of you questioned my fitness to rule. So here's your chance. Challenge me. Any of you. All of you. I'll face you one at a time or together. Your choice. This is madness, Rothland said, but his voice had lost its certainty. This is clarity. Draven stood slowly. You want my crown? Take it, but you'll pry it from my dead hands or you'll learn to live with disappointment. The threat hung in the air like drawn steel, because everyone in that room knew the truth. In single combat, Draven was unbeatable. He'd killed men in armor, trained since childhood, survived battlefields that had broken lesser warriors. Challenging him was suicide, which meant their carefully constructed political trap had just collapsed. You're threatening your own lords? Lord Cassian asked, incredulous. I'm offering them a choice. Draven's smile was sharp. Follow or lead, submit or fight. But what you will not do is hide behind protocol and petition while plotting to strip my authority. We were acting in the kingdom's interest. You were acting in your own interest. Fear that a common-born queen would disrupt your precious hierarchy. Terror that merit might matter more than bloodline. Dread that the world you've built on inherited privilege might actually have to change. The accuracy of it landed hard. Several lords looked away. Rothland held his ground. Even so, forcing the court to accept your bastard? Say that word again. Draven's voice dropped to something lethal. Call my son a bastard one more time and see what happens. The lord's jaw worked. He'd trapped himself and knew it. Lucian is my acknowledged heir, Draven continued. Born of my blood, claimed by my word, and any man who questions his legitimacy questions mine. He pulled the sword from the table, walked slowly around it, making eye contact with each lord in turn. Here's what's going to happen. Lucien will be educated as crown prince. Selene will be recognized as my intended queen. The wedding will occur within 3 months, and every single one of you will attend and smile and pretend you're honored. Or, Malus asked quietly, or you join whatever rebellion you're planning and we settle this the hard way. Draven stopped behind his chair. I'm done negotiating, done compromising, done pretending your comfort matters more than my family. This will fracture the kingdom. Then it fractures. Draven's voice was hard. I spent 10 years holding this kingdom together through battlefield victories and political marriages that meant nothing. I sacrificed everything for stability, and it made me powerful and empty. He looked at Rothland, at Malus, at all 47 lords who'd thought they could control him. I'm not doing it anymore. My son comes first. My woman comes first. And if the kingdom can't survive that, then maybe it doesn't deserve to survive. The words echoed in shocked silence. Because what Draven was proposing was revolutionary. Kings didn't put family before kingdom. Rulers didn't sacrifice political stability for personal happiness. The crown demanded everything. That was the deal. That was what separated kings from common men. Draven was shattering that contract, and everyone in the room understood the implications. You're willing to risk civil war over this? Cassian asked, disbelief evident. I'm willing to risk everything. Draven met his eyes. Because here's what you don't understand. You think threatening war gives you leverage. You think I'll back down to save lives, but you're wrong. He moved to the window, looked out over the city. I've killed men. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. I've ordered soldiers into battles I knew would slaughter them. I've made decisions that cost lives because I believed the kingdom required it, and every death sits in my chest like a stone. He turned back to face them. So when you threaten civil war, when you tell me thousands will die if I don't surrender, you think it's pressure. You think it'll break me. But all I hear is you admitting you'd rather kill your own people than accept change. That's not what... Yes, it is. Draven's voice cut like a blade. You're the ones threatening violence. You're the ones plotting rebellion. You're the ones who would rather burn the kingdom than let an Omega sit beside a king. So here's my counteroffer. Draven placed both hands flat on the table. Stand down. Accept my family. Live with the new reality. Or raise your banners and come for my crown. And when you do, when your armies march and your people die, everyone will know exactly who started it. The political Aikido was perfect. He'd just shifted the entire moral weight of potential civil war onto them. If they rebelled now, they couldn't claim they were saving the kingdom. They'd be the aggressors, the ones who valued tradition over peace, the ones who'd rather kill than adapt. Rothlin's face had gone purple. This is extortion. This is consequence. Draven's smile was cold. You spent weeks plotting this, coordinating, building your coalition. You thought you had me trapped, that I'd choose peace over family. But you forgot one crucial detail. What? I'm not the man I was 4 years ago. That man was afraid of scandal, terrified of judgment, so desperate for approval that he threw away the woman he loved. He paused. That man died in Hollowmere. What came back is someone who finally understands what actually matters. And what's that? Malus asked quietly. Legacy isn't about how many provinces you conquer. It's about whether your children remember you with love or fear. Power isn't about dominating others. It's about protecting what you can't bear to lose. And being a king means nothing if it requires destroying your own humanity. He picked up his sword, sheathed it slowly. So make your choice, lords. Bend or break, accept or rebel. But understand this. I will not negotiate my family away. I will not compromise their safety. And I will not spend another day pretending your traditions matter more than their lives. The silence that followed was absolute. 47 men realizing simultaneously that they'd miscalculated, that the king they thought they knew had become someone else entirely, someone who'd rather rule over ashes than surrender what he loved, someone dangerous, not because of his strength, but because he'd stopped caring about the cost. And there's nothing more terrifying than a powerful man who's decided he has nothing left to lose. Malus stood slowly. Your Majesty, if you proceed with this, you will face opposition. Significant opposition. I'm counting on it. Draven met his eyes. Because anyone who opposes me now identifies themselves as an enemy, makes the battlefield cleaner. You would turn on your own lords? I would protect my family from anyone who threatens them. Even lords, even advisors, even people I once called friends. This is not the man we followed. No. Draven's voice was quiet. That man followed you, listened to your counsel, valued your approval. This man leads, and you either follow or you become obstacles to remove. The threat was clear. Absolute. Final. Lord Cassian stood. I will not be part of this. Then leave. The Lord blinked. What? You heard me? Leave. Resign your position. Go back to your lands. Live in peace. I won't stop you. And my seat on the council will be filled by someone who understands that the world is changing whether they like it or not. Cassian stared at him, then slowly, deliberately removed his council ring and placed it on the table. He walked out without another word. 3 other lords followed, then 6 more. One by one, the coalition fractured. Men who'd signed the petition now faced with the reality that opposing Draven meant actual consequences. Loss of position, loss of influence, possibly loss of land if he decided to make examples. When the exodus stopped, 23 lords remained, less than half the original group. Draven looked at them, the ones who'd stayed, the ones too proud or too committed or too stupid to back down. These were the real threats, the ones who'd fight. Rothlin stood last, his expression carved from granite. You've made a powerful enemy today, he said quietly. I've made 47. Draven's voice was cold. What's one more? The Lord walked out, and with him went the last pretense of civility. This was war now, not declared, not official, but inevitable. Malus remained seated, alone, looking older suddenly. You've just split the kingdom, he said quietly. It was already split. I just forced everyone to choose sides. And when the fighting starts, when houses tear themselves apart over this, then I'll know who my real allies are. Draven sat down heavily. And I'll deal with my enemies accordingly. At what cost? Whatever it takes. The Chancellor studied him for a long moment. I've served 3 kings, he said finally. Your grandfather, your father, you. And I've never seen one willing to burn everything for personal desire. It's not desire. Draven's voice was raw. It's love. And if you can't tell the difference, then you've never felt it. Perhaps not. Melis stood. But I know duty. I know sacrifice. I know what it means to put the kingdom before yourself. So did I. That's why I'm still here instead of in Hollowmere living the life I want. Draven met his eyes. I'm not abandoning the kingdom. I'm fighting to make it better. A place where my son doesn't have to be ashamed of his mother. Where bloodline doesn't trump character. Where love isn't weakness. Noble words. The Chancellor moved toward the door. I hope they comfort you when the kingdom bleeds. He left. Draven sat alone in the council chamber, surrounded by empty chairs and abandoned ring seals and the ghost of a coalition that had collapsed the moment he'd called their bluff. He'd won the first battle, but the war was just beginning. Night. Celine found him there an hour later. She took in the scene, the empty chamber, the sword marks on the table, his expression. What did you do? What I had to. He stood, suddenly exhausted. I forced them to choose. Most chose survival. Some chose pride. And the ones who chose pride will come for us eventually. She moved closer. How many? 23 lords, plus their bannermen and allies. Maybe 10,000 soldiers total. Against? The royal army, 30,000, plus loyalist houses. So we have the numbers. Numbers don't win civil wars. Draven's voice was hollow. Conviction does, and they're convinced they're fighting for tradition, for stability, for everything that keeps the world they know intact. What are we fighting for? The right to love without permission. The words hung between them. Celine reached for his hand, squeezed gently. I didn't want this, she said quietly. I know. I wanted to disappear, to take Lucien and vanish, to save everyone this pain. Would have been easier. Yes. Draven pulled her close. But you know what I learned today? What? Easier isn't better. Running would have kept us safe, kept the kingdom stable, avoided bloodshed, but it would have taught Lucien that love loses, that power always wins, that who you are matters less than where you're born. She rested her head against his chest. And now? What does this teach him? That some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost is terrible. They stood that way for a long moment. Then Lucien's voice broke the silence. The boy appeared in the doorway, small and uncertain. Papa, is there going to be a war? Draven knelt down, eye level with his son. Maybe. Because of me? The question destroyed him. No, Draven said firmly, not because of you, because some people are afraid of change, because tradition is easier than growth, because the world we have isn't ready for the world we need. I don't understand. I know. Draven pulled him close. And that's okay. But I need you to remember something. Whatever happens next, whatever you hear people say, this isn't your fault. You didn't ask to be born. You didn't choose your bloodline. You're just a boy who deserves to exist without shame. Lucien's eyes were huge. Will people try to hurt us? Probably. I'm scared. Me too. The honesty seemed to comfort the boy more than false reassurance would have. But Papa, Lucien said slowly, you're the king. Can't you just make them stop? And there it was, the innocent question that exposed the fundamental lie of absolute power. No, Draven said quietly. Being king means people have to obey my laws. But it doesn't mean I can make them agree with me. It doesn't mean I can force them to accept what they hate. Real power isn't about making people bow. It's about giving them reasons to choose to stand beside you. How do you do that? I'm still figuring it out. Celine was watching them both, tears streaming silently down her face. Because this was the price. This was what loving them cost. Not just political opposition, not just civil war, but forcing his 4-year-old son to understand that existing was a radical act, that being himself was a threat to people who'd never met him. What kind of father did that to his child? The kind who refused to abandon him again. The kind who'd rather fight impossible battles than teach his son that love requires surrender. The kind who'd finally learned that some things matter more than peace. "Mama," Lucien said suddenly, "why are you crying?" "Because I love you both." Celine's voice was thick. "And I'm terrified. Of the war? Of losing you." "You won't." Draven stood, pulling them both close. "Whatever happens, we face it together. Promise?" "Promise." It was the same promise he'd made in Hollowmere, the one that had brought them here, the one that had detonated his kingdom and turned half his lords into enemies, the promise that defined everything, family first, even when it cost the world. The next 3 weeks passed in mounting tension. Houses began taking sides, Rothland's coalition grew, loyalist lords fortified their positions, trade routes became battle lines. Cities that had known peace for decades suddenly found themselves preparing for siege. Draven worked 18-hour days, military planning, diplomatic maneuvering, trying to shore up support while preparing for war. Celine trained in palace protocol, learning to navigate shark-infested social waters. She was getting death threats, letters calling her whore, seductress, omega trash. Someone left a dead rat in her chambers with a note saying bastard makers deserve worse. Lucien stopped sleeping through the night. The palace became a fortress. Guards everywhere. Food tasters. Locked doors and suspicious faces. This was what love cost in the world they'd built. Blood and fear and children who flinched at loud sounds. On the 20th day, news arrived. Rothland had declared open rebellion. 10 houses had joined him. They'd seized 3 border fortresses and were calling for other lords to stand against the king's madness. The civil war had officially begun. Draven called his war council, generals and advisors, battle-hardened men who'd followed him through a dozen campaigns. "We have 3 options," General Kane said, pointing at a map. "Crush them quickly before more houses join, negotiate some kind of compromise, or fortify here and let them wear themselves out attacking." "No compromise," Draven said flatly. "Sire, we could offer—" I said no. He'd promised himself. Promised Celine. No more compromising his family away. "Then it's war." Kane nodded. "Total war. With everything that implies." Everything that implied was thousands of dead. Burned villages, orphaned children, the kind of devastation that would scar the kingdom for generations. All because Draven had chosen love over tradition. The weight of it should have crushed him, should have made him reconsider, should have driven him to find another way. But looking at Celine across the room, at Lucien playing quietly with wooden soldiers, Draven felt something else entirely. Clarity. Because here's the truth about power that most people never learn. It doesn't matter how many armies you command, or how much wealth you control, or how many people bow when you walk by. Real power is the ability to protect what matters when the entire world tries to take it away. And Draven had finally figured out what mattered. Not his crown, not his legacy, not his place in history, just 2 people who loved him despite knowing exactly who he was. That was worth any price. Even this one. "Prepare the armies," he said quietly. "We march in 3 days." The generals nodded and filed out, leaving Draven alone with Malus, who'd stayed silent throughout the meeting. "You're really doing this," the Chancellor said. "Yes. Thousands will die." "I know. And you can live with that?" Draven met his eyes. "Can you live with teaching my son that he has to hide who he is to survive? Can you live with telling Celine that her love matters less than noble comfort? Can you live with a kingdom that values bloodline over humanity? Those aren't the only options. Yes, they are. That's what you keep missing. There's no middle ground here. Either Lucien is my legitimate heir, or he isn't. Either Celine is worthy of being queen, or she isn't. Either this kingdom evolves, or it stagnates. Evolution costs. So does stagnation." Draven turned back to the map. Ask the common people. Ask the merchants and farmers and soldiers. Ask everyone who isn't noble-born how they feel about a system that tells them their children can never rise above their station. You're using them. Making this about class warfare when it's really about your personal desire. Maybe. Draven's smile was sharp. Or maybe my personal desire just happens to align with what half the kingdom has wanted for generations. A chance to matter. A chance for merit to count more than birthright. Pretty words for civil war. Better than your words for surrender. Malus studied him for a long moment. You've changed. Yes. I'm not sure it's for the better. I don't care what you think anymore. The honesty was liberating. I've spent my entire life caring what people like you think, valuing approval from men who'd sacrifice anything to maintain comfort. I'm done. Then I suppose there's nothing more to say. I suppose not. The Chancellor walked toward the door, paused. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I hope you win. Why? Because if you don't, they'll kill her. They'll kill the boy. And they'll spend the next 100 years telling stories about the mad king who burned the realm for a whore. Draven's hands curled into fists. Get out. Malus left, and Draven stood alone in the war room, surrounded by maps that showed a kingdom tearing itself apart, and felt the full weight of what he'd set in motion. 3 days until the armies marched. 3 days until the killing started. 3 days until he'd find out if love could actually survive what politics demanded. The door opened. Celine entered, carrying 2 cups of wine. Couldn't sleep, she said simply. Me either. She handed him a cup, sat beside him. They drank in silence, watching candles burn down and shadows lengthen. Do you ever wish, she started, then stopped. What? That we'd never met. That you'd never noticed me. That I'd stayed invisible. Every day, Draven said honestly. She looked at him, hurt flickering across her face. Because then you'd be safe, he continued. Lucien would be happy in Hollowmere. You'd be alive and whole, and I'd just be another miserable king slowly dying inside his crown. The world would be simpler. But I'd rather have you here, terrified and threatened, than safe somewhere I can't reach you. Because the years without you were the emptiest of my life. And whatever happens next, at least I won't die wondering what could have been. Celine's hand found his. That's not comforting. I'm not trying to comfort you. I'm trying to be honest. She leaned against him. I'm so scared. Me too. What if we lose? Then we lose together. What if they kill Lucien? They won't. Draven's voice turned to iron. They'll have to kill me first. That's what I'm afraid of. They sat that way until dawn painted the windows gold. 3 days until the war started. 3 days until everything they'd fought for would be tested in blood and fire. 3 days until Draven would find out if a king could actually choose love over power and survive. The answer waited on battlefields not yet soaked in blood, in the hearts of men not yet committed to killing, in the soul of a kingdom that had never had to choose between tradition and change, and in the eyes of a 4-year-old boy who deserved a world better than the one his parents had inherited. The sun rose. The armies prepared. And in the obsidian palace of Vareth, a family held each other close and waited for the storm to break. Because some battles can't be avoided. Some wars have to be fought. And some loves are worth burning the world to protect. The only question was whether the world would survive the burning, or whether 3 people who'd chosen each other over everything would end up as ash in the wind. The answer was coming. 3 days. 3 days until everything changed. 3 days until the Lion King finally learned whether courage was enough, or whether some prices are too high even for love. The armies met on the plains of Kethril, where his grandfather had once crushed a rebellion 3 generations ago, history repeating itself with bitter irony. 30,000 loyal soldiers on one side, banners streaming in morning wind, the royal standard flying above them all, obsidian and gold, the lion of the north roaring defiance. On the other side, 10,000 rebels, smaller force, deadlier conviction, men who believed they were saving the kingdom from a mad king's obsession. Between them, 300 yards of grass that would soon run red. Draven sat on his war horse at the front of his army, fully armored, sword at his side. He'd left Celine and Lucien in the capital under heavy guard. Their last goodbye had been brutal. Lucien crying, Celine trying to be strong and failing, both of them understanding that this might be the last time they saw him alive. Some wars don't allow for happy endings. Some battles cost everything regardless of who wins. And Draven had learned the hard way that love doesn't make you invincible. It just gives you something worth dying for. General Kane rode up beside him. They're ready, sire. Waiting for your order. Draven looked across the field at Rothland's army, saw the hatred in their formation, the certainty that they were righteous, the conviction that dying to preserve tradition was noble, He understood them better than they knew, because he'd been them once. A man so afraid of change that he'd destroyed what mattered to preserve what he thought he needed. The difference was he'd learned. They hadn't. And now thousands would die because fear disguised itself as principle and convinced good men to do evil things. "One last chance," Draven said quietly. "Ride forward under peace banner. Offer them terms." Cain blinked. "What terms?" "Stand down, go home, keep their lands and titles, no punishment, complete amnesty." "They won't accept." "Probably not. But I need them to refuse. I need everyone watching to see that I tried." The general nodded slowly. Understanding the politics, if Draven could show he'd offered mercy and been rejected, the moral weight shifted. This became their choice, their violence, their refusal to compromise. Cain rode forward with 2 bannermen carrying white flags. The battlefield fell silent, 30,000 men on one side, 10,000 on the other, all watching 2 riders approach the enemy line. They talked for 10 minutes. Draven was too far to hear words, but he could read body language. Rothlin's contemptuous dismissal, Cain's formal bow, the rebel lord's laughter. Then Cain rode back. His face told the story before his words did. He said you can keep your whore and bastard when you pry his crown from his cold, dead hands. Of course he did. "There's more." Cain's voice was tight. "He says if you surrender now, he'll let the woman and child live, exiled to the frontier, under house arrest. But alive. Generous of him. He's serious, sire. He believes he's being merciful." And Draven understood something crucial in that moment. Rothlin genuinely thought he was the hero of this story. The loyal lord saving his kingdom from a corrupted king. The man willing to fight and die for tradition and stability and everything that made sense. He couldn't see that he was just another tyrant protecting his comfort by calling it duty. But that's how tyranny works. It convinces itself it's necessary, persuades itself that cruelty is kindness, paints brutality as strength, and calls mercy weakness. Every monster believes he's righteous. Every oppressor thinks he's preserving order. Every man who chooses fear over growth tells himself he's being wise instead of cowardly. Draven had almost become that man. Would have, if Celine hadn't existed to show him another way. If Lucien hadn't been born to prove that love mattered more than bloodline. "Send word back," Draven said quietly. "I will never surrender my family. Not to him. Not to anyone. And if he wants my crown, he can try to take it." Cain rode back, delivered the message. Rothlin's response was to draw his sword and raise it high. The rebel army roared, and the last chance for peace died on the plains of Kethril under a morning sun that didn't care who lived or died. Draven drew his own blade, felt its familiar weight, the sword that had killed rebels and invaders and men who'd thought they could challenge his authority. Now it would kill men who'd once sworn loyalty to him, former allies, maybe even former friends. All because he'd chosen love over tradition, and they'd chosen tradition over everything else. The tragedy of it should have broken him, should have made him reconsider, should have driven him to find another way. But sitting there on his warhorse with 30,000 soldiers waiting for his command, Draven felt something else entirely, certainty. Because here's what he'd finally learned through all the pain and loss and impossible choices. Being right doesn't prevent suffering. Having good reasons doesn't stop the bleeding. And loving someone with your whole heart doesn't protect them from the world's brutality. But none of that changes what you have to do. None of that excuses surrender. None of that justifies abandoning the people who matter just because protecting them is hard. "For the kingdom!" Rothlin's voice carried across the field. "For tradition! For the crown!" His army charged, 10,000 men screaming hatred and conviction, believing absolutely they were righteous, certain they were heroes. Draven watched them come, watched death approach on horseback and foot, watched everything he'd been trying to avoid become inevitable. Then he turned to his own army, looked at 30,000 faces, some eager for battle, some terrified, all waiting for him to give them a reason to kill or die. And Draven understood that this moment defined everything. What he said now, what he gave them to fight for, it would echo through history and shape how this day was remembered. He could make this about power, about crushing rebellion, about proving that kings don't compromise. Or he could tell them the truth. "I didn't want this war," he said. His voice carried across the ranks. I wanted peace. I wanted to bring my family home and build a kingdom that didn't require us to destroy ourselves to sustain it. The army listened. But peace requires both sides wanting it, and he gestured at the charging rebels, they want the world to stay exactly as it is. Where bloodline matters more than character, where love is weakness, where change is treason. He raised his sword. I'm done living in that world. Done pretending power matters more than people. Done sacrificing what I love for what I fear. So today we fight. Not for my crown, not for my pride, but for a future where my son doesn't have to be ashamed of his mother. Where merit counts more than birthright. Where love isn't a liability. The rebels were 200 yards away now, close enough to see individual faces. Men who'd attended the same councils, fought the same battles, served the same kingdom. About to kill each other over whether that kingdom could evolve or had to stagnate. If you can't fight for that, Draven said quietly, then ride away now. No shame, no punishment. Just leave, because I won't ask men to die for something they don't believe in. Nobody moved. 30,000 soldiers standing firm, not because they had to, not because he'd ordered it, but because somewhere in his words they'd found something worth fighting for. The possibility that the world could be better, that their children might have more choices than they'd had, that maybe, just maybe, loving someone didn't have to cost everything. For the future, Draven roared. The army echoed him. For the future! The two forces collided with the sound of thunder breaking the world open. And the plains of Kethril learned what happens when fear meets hope on a battlefield and neither is willing to surrender. But war is chaos. No matter how many battles you've fought, no matter how well you've planned. The moment steel meets flesh, strategy becomes survival and everything reduces to simple mathematics. Kill or be killed. Draven fought like a man possessed. His sword rose and fell, cutting through armor, breaking shields, ending lives with ruthless efficiency. Men came at him, alpha warriors who'd trained their whole lives. He killed them, not with pleasure, not with rage, just with the cold competence of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly what it cost. Around him, the battle raged, 30,000 against 10,000. Numbers should have made it simple, should have led to quick victory. But the rebels fought with the fury of true believers. Men who'd rather die than live in a world that violated everything they thought was sacred. That kind of conviction makes soldiers dangerous, makes them willing to trade their lives for damage, makes them fight past wounds that should drop them. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it ended, 5,000 men lay dead or dying, most of them rebels. The mathematics had worked eventually, superior numbers grinding down conviction until nothing remained but corpses and screaming wounded. Draven stood in the center of the carnage, blood-soaked and breathing hard. His armor was dented, his sword notched from impact. His body ached from wounds he'd barely registered taking. But he was alive, and across the field, Rothlin knelt in surrender, surrounded by the remnants of his army. Maybe 3,000 left, broken, defeated, staring at their lord with expressions ranging from betrayal to relief. General Kane approached. It's over, sire. They're asking for terms. Draven walked toward Rothlin. Each step hurt. Each breath tasted like blood and smoke. Around him, soldiers moved through the wounded, helping their own, executing enemies too injured to survive. The cost of his choice made visible in shattered bodies and emptied lives. He stopped in front of Rothlin. The Lord looked up with eyes full of hate. Kill me and be done with it. No. Rothlin blinked. What? I'm not going to kill you. Draven sheathed his sword. I'm going to let you live. You and everyone who fought with you. Complete amnesty. That makes no sense. It makes perfect sense. Draven looked at the rebels, at men who'd believed they were fighting for something righteous. I'm not trying to crush opposition. I'm trying to prove that change doesn't require slaughter. You think mercy makes you strong? Rothlin's laugh was bitter. It makes you weak. These men will go home, lick their wounds, come back stronger. Maybe. Draven knelt down. Eye level. Or maybe they'll go home and realize that I'm not the monster you told them I was. Maybe they'll see their children and wonder if bloodline really matters more than character. Maybe some of them will change. You're a fool, I've been called worse. By better men. Draven stood, looked at General Kane. Send them home. All of them. Confiscate weapons, but let them keep their dignity. And make sure every soldier who fought today gets proper burial. Ours and theirs. Sire, the men expect executions. Examples. Then they'll be disappointed. This war is over, and I won't start the next one by proving I'm exactly what they claimed. Kane nodded slowly. Yes, Your Majesty. Draven turned to walk away. Rothlin's voice stopped him. Why? The question was genuine, confused, from a man whose entire worldview had just collapsed. Draven looked back. Because someone has to break the cycle. Someone has to choose mercy over vengeance. And I'm tired of being the kind of king who solves problems by killing people. Your father would have executed every rebel. I know. That's why I'm not him. He walked away from Rothlin, from the battlefield, from 5,000 corpses that represented the price of choosing love over tradition. And he felt nothing but exhaustion. No triumph, no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Just the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd won a battle but knew the war was far from over. Because killing Rothlin would have been easy. Executing the rebels would have sent a message. Fear keeps people in line. Violence maintains order. But Draven was done building kingdoms on fear. Done maintaining order through violence. Done being the kind of ruler who controlled people by making them afraid. He wanted to be the kind of king people chose to follow. The kind of father his son could be proud of. The kind of man who proved that strength could exist alongside mercy. Whether he'd succeeded or failed, history would decide. All he knew right now was that he was alive. His family was safe. And he'd survived the day without becoming the monster everyone feared. That was enough. For now. The journey back to Vareth took 4 days. Draven rode in silence, surrounded by an army that had tasted victory but couldn't quite celebrate it. Too many friends dead. Too many brothers lost. Too much blood spilled for political disagreement. They understood what they'd been fighting for. Most agreed it was necessary, but understanding and agreeing didn't erase the cost. On the third night, camped under stars that had watched this same story play out across generations, Draven sat alone by the fire. General Kane approached, sat down without asking permission. "The men are talking," he said quietly. "About what?" "About whether you're strong enough to rule. Some say mercy to Rothlin was wisdom. Others call it weakness. What do you think?" Kane stared into the flames. "I think strength is complicated. I think your father would have killed every rebel and ruled through fear for another decade. And I think you're trying to rule through something else." "What?" "Hope, maybe. The idea that people can change, that the world can be better, that force isn't the only way to maintain order. Does that make me weak? Makes you different." Kane met his eyes. "Whether different is better, we'll find out. Give it 10 years. See if the houses that rebelled stay loyal. See if your son grows up respected or resented. See if history calls you wise or foolish. And if they call me foolish, then at least you were foolish for the right reasons." The general stood, left Draven alone with his thoughts, and the ghost of 5,000 men who'd died so he could choose love over tradition. That night he dreamed of Lucian, his son grown, standing before the same council that had tried to destroy him. And in the dream, Lucian ruled with kindness instead of fear, with wisdom instead of force, with the certainty that came from being raised by parents who'd proven love was stronger than power. It was just a dream, just hope disguised as prophecy. But it kept him warm through the cold night and gave him strength to face what waited in Vareth. They entered the capital to silence. No cheering crowds, no celebration, just people lining the streets and watching their king return from a war that should never have been necessary. Some faces showed relief, others contempt. Most revealed nothing but the careful neutrality of subjects who'd learned not to show loyalty too openly when the political landscape kept shifting. Draven rode through it all with his head high and his expression calm. Not arrogant, not ashamed, just present, just there, being the king he'd chosen to be. The palace courtyard held Celine and Lucian. She'd dressed in palace finery that looked wrong on her somehow, too formal, too distant, like she was playing a role instead of being herself. But when their eyes met across the courtyard, none of that mattered. She ran to him, propriety forgotten, Court protocol abandoned. Just a woman who'd spent 4 days wondering if the man she loved would come back or arrive as a corpse draped over a horse. Draven dismounted, caught her, held her while she cried against his armor. "You're alive," she whispered. "Barely." Lucian crashed into both of them, small arms wrapping around his father's legs. "Papa!" Draven knelt, pulled his son close, let himself feel everything he'd been holding back for 4 days. The fear, the grief, the desperate love that made all of it worthwhile. "Did we win?" Lucian asked. Draven looked at Celine Shishi, at her tear-streaked face and trembling hands, at the woman who'd survived 4 years alone and 4 days of terror, wondering if loving him was a fatal mistake. "Yes," he said quietly. "We won." But even as he said it, he knew the truth was more complicated. They'd won the battle, crushed the rebellion, proven that he could hold his kingdom against internal threats. But the war for acceptance? For genuine change? For a world where Lucian could rule without shame and Celine could exist without contempt? That war was just beginning. And it wouldn't be won with swords. It would be won through daily choices, through building trust, through proving over and over that love didn't make you weak, that family didn't compromise your ability to lead, that choosing people over power was strength, not surrender. It might take years, might take generations, might never fully succeed. But standing there with his family in his arms and his kingdom watching, Draven made a choice about what kind of king he'd be moving forward. Not the conqueror his father had been, not the warrior his grandfather had praised, not the alpha who dominated through force. Just a man who loved his family and served his people and tried every day to build something better than what he'd inherited. That was the only victory that mattered, the only war worth fighting, the only legacy that would last. The coronation happened 3 months later, not Draven's. He'd been crowned years ago. This was different. This was the formal recognition of Lucien as crown prince, the public acknowledgement of Celine as intended queen, the moment when everything they'd fought for became official. The great hall filled with nobles from every corner of the kingdom. Some came willingly. Others came because refusing would mark them as traitors. All came because Draven had made it clear that this wasn't optional. Lucian stood beside his father on the dais. 5 years old now. Still small. Still uncertain. But carrying himself with the quiet dignity he'd learned from his mother. The boy wore formal robes that had been tailored to fit him. Crown prince insignia. Everything marking him as heir to an empire. And every person in that hall knew he was common-born, knew his mother had been a servant, knew this violated every tradition they held sacred. But they were here anyway, because power in the end is just collective agreement, and Draven had forced them to agree by proving he'd rather burn the kingdom than compromise his family. That's not how leadership should work. Not according to any philosophy or political theory. Kings are supposed to sacrifice the personal for the political. Rulers aren't supposed to put family before kingdom. But standing there watching his son take the oath of fealty, Draven understood something that all the philosophy and theory missed. The personal and political aren't separate. The way you treat your family reveals how you'll treat your kingdom. The values you model at home echo in how you rule, and a king who can't love his own son without shame will never truly value his common subjects. Lord Rothlin attended, alive and pardoned and watching with barely concealed disgust. Malus stood nearby, his expression carefully neutral. Other lords who'd supported the rebellion filled the back rows, present but hostile. The opposition hadn't disappeared. The tension hadn't resolved. Victory on the battlefield didn't translate to victory in hearts and minds. But something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed, and everyone in that hall understood that this was the new reality. Lucien was crown prince. Celine would be queen, and anyone who couldn't accept it could leave the kingdom or learn to live with disappointment. The ceremony concluded. Lucien recited words he'd practiced for weeks, promising to serve the kingdom, to uphold its laws, to be worthy of the crown he'd someday inherit. His voice was small in the vast hall, childish and uncertain, but he didn't falter, didn't freeze, just spoke his piece and stood beside his father with quiet courage. And watching him, Draven felt something crack open in his chest. All the fear and doubt and questioning whether he'd made the right choice. It all fell away. Because right there, in front of everyone who'd called him illegitimate and unworthy and bastard, Lucian was proving them wrong just by existing with dignity. The ceremony ended. The nobles filed out. Some bowed to Lucien as they passed. Others ignored him. A few offered congratulations that felt sincere. When the hall finally emptied, just family remained. Draven, Celine, Lucian, and Mara Thorne, who'd stayed through everything because someone needed to keep them grounded. "Did I do okay?" Lucien asked nervously. "You did perfect," Celine said, kneeling to embrace him. "I was scared. Being brave means doing things even when you're scared." Draven watched them, mother and son. The two people who'd changed everything, who'd forced him to confront every comfortable lie he'd told himself about duty and sacrifice and what kings couldn't afford to feel. Mara approached him. Her expression was softer than usual. "You survived," she said. "Barely. That's all survival ever is. Barely making it through and hoping it's enough." Was it enough? The old woman looked at Lucian, at Celine, at the family they'd built from wreckage and impossible choices. "Ask me in 20 years," she said. "See if the boy grows up kind. See if the kingdom prospers. See if the changes you fought for actually take root, or if tradition crushes them eventually. And if tradition wins, then at least you tried. That's more than most kings can say." She walked away, leaving Draven alone with the two people who mattered most. Celine stood, took his hand. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we live," Draven said simply. "We raise our son. We rule as best we can. We make mistakes and learn from them and try to build something worth passing on. That's it? That's your grand plan? That's all I've got?" She laughed, soft and genuine, the first real laugh he'd heard from her in months. "Then I suppose it'll have to be enough." They left the Great Hall together, a family walking through corridors that had once felt like a prison but now felt like possibility. Because that's what they'd won. Not acceptance, not universal approval, not the end of opposition or the guarantee of success, just the right to exist, the right to love each other without shame, the right to build a future that looked different than the past. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Years passed. Lucien grew into a young man respected for his character rather than his bloodline. He ruled eventually when Draven finally stepped down, and history called him the Good King. Not because he was perfect, but because he'd learned from his parents that leadership meant serving rather than dominating. Celine became the kind of queen who changed what the title meant. Not through political maneuvering or noble scheming, just through being herself, present with common people, understanding their struggles, building a kingdom that valued everyone instead of just the powerful. Draven lived long enough to see his grandchildren, long enough to watch the changes he'd fought for take root, long enough to know that choosing love over power hadn't destroyed the kingdom. It had saved it. Not immediately, not completely, but slowly, steadily. One generation learning that the old ways didn't have to be eternal. One child at a time discovering that they could be more than their bloodline. One family after another realizing that love wasn't weakness. On his deathbed, surrounded by family and legacy, Draven reflected on the choice that had defined everything: kingdom or family, power or love, crown or heart. He'd spent years believing they were opposites, that choosing one meant destroying the other, that love and leadership couldn't coexist. But lying there with Celine holding one hand and Lucien holding the other, he finally understood the truth. They'd never been opposites. Love was leadership, family was kingdom, the personal was political. And the strongest thing he'd ever done wasn't conquering provinces or crushing rebellions or expanding an empire. It was choosing to love openly, despite everyone who said it would destroy him. That was real power, not dominance, not control, not force, just the courage to be vulnerable, to need someone, to admit that no crown was worth losing your humanity. "Did I do the right thing?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Celine leaned close, tears streaming down her aged face. "You chose us. That's all that ever mattered. The kingdom didn't fall?" Lucien smiled. "The kingdom flourished, Father, because you taught us that strength comes from protecting what you love, not from pretending you love nothing." Draven closed his eyes, felt peace settle over him like winter snow, clean, complete, final. He'd been the lion of the north, the unconquered king, the alpha who'd never lost a battle. But his greatest victory had nothing to do with warfare or politics or imperial expansion. It was lying there, surrounded by love and knowing he'd chosen right, even when it cost everything, even when everyone said he was wrong, even when the price seemed too high. He'd chosen love, and love had chosen him back. And that had made all the difference. His last thought before the darkness took him was simple and true. Some wars are won on battlefields, others are won in hearts. And the second kind matters more than the first. Always. Araik. The funeral drew thousands, common people and nobles alike, all coming to honor a king who'd proven that power could exist alongside mercy, that tradition could evolve, that love was strength. Lucian stood at the pyre, his own children beside him, the legacy continuing. He thought about his father, about the man who'd almost abandoned him, who'd thrown away his mother, who'd been so afraid of love that he'd nearly destroyed everything, and then about the man who'd come back, who'd fought for them, who'd risked his crown and his kingdom and his life, because family mattered more than power. That transformation, that journey from fear to courage, from dominance to love, that was the real story. Not the battles won or territories claimed, but the internal war one man fought to become someone worthy of being loved. As the flames rose, Lucian made a promise. He'd continue what his father started, build on the foundation of courage and mercy, teach his own children that bloodline mattered less than character, that love wasn't weakness, that the best legacy was raising people who were kinder than you'd been. The fire consumed the body of King Draven Morcant, the Lion of the North, the unconquered. The man who'd finally learned that the greatest victory wasn't dominating others. It was becoming someone worth following, worth loving, worth remembering not for your power but for your humanity. And as smoke rose toward stars that had watched this story unfold across generations, the kingdom he'd changed looked toward a future he'd made possible, where merit counted more than birthright, where love was celebrated instead of hidden, where children like Lucian could exist without shame. That was the true crown. Not gold and obsidian, not military might or political dominance, just the simple revolutionary act of choosing people over tradition, heart over power, love over fear, and proving that sometimes, just sometimes, courage wins. Change happens. And the world becomes a little bit better because one person decided that loving someone was worth any price, even a kingdom, even a crown, even everything they'd built. Because in the end, what's the point of ruling the world if you lose your soul in the process? What's the purpose of power if it can't protect what matters? What's the value of a crown if wearing it requires destroying your own humanity? Draven had answered those questions, not with words, but with choices, with sacrifice, with the relentless pursuit of a world where his son could live without shame and his woman could exist without fear. That was his legacy. Not the territories he'd conquered or the battles he'd won, but the family he'd chosen and the kingdom he'd changed, and the proof that love, stubborn and inconvenient and politically catastrophic, was still the most powerful force in existence. The fire burned through the night, and when dawn came, the ashes scattered on wind that carried them across a kingdom forever altered by one man's refusal to sacrifice what mattered for what was easy. They say power corrupts. That authority breeds cruelty, that crowns turn men into monsters. But standing there watching dawn break over Vareth, Lucian understood a different truth. Power reveals. Authority magnifies. Crowns amplify what already existed in your heart. His father had been afraid, had dominated because he didn't know how to connect, had ruled through force because love terrified him. But when given the choice between his fear and his family, he'd chosen family. And that choice had echoed across generations, changed a kingdom, proven that even the most broken person could become someone worth remembering, not for their strength, but for their courage to become something better. That was the story. That was the legacy. That was the truth that would outlive monuments and outlast empires. Love mattered. Family mattered. And sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit you needed someone more than you needed your crown. The sun rose fully. A new day beginning. A kingdom continuing. A story ending where it began. With three people who'd chosen each other against impossible odds, who'd fought tradition and won, who'd proven that the greatest power wasn't dominion over others. It was belonging to someone, being known completely, being loved despite every flaw and failing. That was Draven's triumph, Celine's victory, Lucien's inheritance. Not a crown, not a kingdom, not an empire. Just the simple revolutionary truth that love, messy and inconvenient and politically disastrous, was worth fighting for. Always.